You're here to relax, and I'm here to guide you. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let go of everything that happened today. This moment is just for you. In the calm of the night, or the stillness of the early morning, wherever you are, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and it helps me feel closer to you, even across the distance. Now close your eyes if you'd like. Let's begin. I never used to mind staying late at the office. In fact, I often welcomed it. The quiet, the stillness, the uninterrupted focus, it gave me a strange kind of peace. The tapping of keys, the soft hum of my computer, and the occasional groan of the building settling were sounds I had come to associate with productivity and solitude. After everyone left, the buzzing fluorescence dimmed to a hum, and the open floor plan that usually felt chaotic transformed into a calm, predictable space. The cluttered desks of my coworkers were reduced to mere shadows. The overhead lights cast long, soft reflections on the polished floor, and everything felt oddly serene, like I was the only person in the world. I worked as a graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing agency in downtown Seattle. We occupied the 10th floor of an old high-rise, a building with creaky elevators and windows that rattled on windy days. It had character, history, and a faint musty scent that no renovation could completely mask. Most nights, the cleaning crew would come in around 9 p.m. to empty trash bins and vacuum carpets, their presence a comforting background noise. But that evening, Thursday, the office was eerily silent. The cleaning crew hadn't shown up. There were no other footsteps, no idle chatter from the break room, no distant printers whirring to life. I was alone, really alone. I had my late-night rhythm down to a science. First, I'd put on my headphones, cue up a playlist of ambient instrumental tracks, and lose myself in design work. The hours slipped by as I manipulated images, adjusted layers, and refined layouts, each mouse click and keystroke pulling me deeper into the creative zone. Around 8:30, like clockwork, I'd take a break. I walked the quiet hallway to the break room. The hum of the vending machine and the microwave's soft whir, the only sounds that accompanied me. I warmed up the leftovers I'd packed earlier that morning, mac and cheese this time, and sat by the window with my phone in one hand and a plastic fork in the other. Sometimes I'd scroll through social media, but usually I called my sister. We didn't always have long chats, but hearing her voice was grounding. That night, we laughed about something trivial, a meme she sent me, and I promised to call her again over the weekend. After dinner, I refilled my water bottle, passed by the quiet cubicles, and settled back into my chair to finish the last few items on my to-do list. My office felt like my own little cocoon, safe, productive, still. That Thursday was no different, at least not at first. I was deep into refining a campaign layout, lost in Photoshop layers and adjustment masks, when I noticed something strange. The hallway lights outside my office flickered. Just once. Then, everything went dark for half a second before the lights buzzed back to life. I pulled off my headphones. Silence. Not the usual kind, the soft background hum of a building at rest, but a silence that felt sudden, intentional, like something was listening. I tried to shake it off. Old buildings have quirks, right? Power surges, bad wiring. I went back to work. But the silence outside my office felt different. Heavy, like the air had thickened somehow. Then I heard it, a soft click, the sound of a door handle turning. I froze, listening. Another click, a little closer this time. Then the sound of footsteps, light, deliberate, on the carpeted hallway. I stood up slowly, moved toward my door, and peeked out. Nothing. I walked out into the hallway. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow across the cubicles and break room beyond. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I walked toward the main entrance, where the elevators and stairwell sat at the far end. The security lights were on. Everything looked normal. Still, I checked the break room. empty. Bathroom, empty. Conference room, empty. I was alone, or so I thought. Back at my desk, I tried to concentrate, but the unease lingered. I stared at my screen, rereading the same email 3 times without comprehension. Then I looked up. There's a window across from my desk that faces the adjacent office building, another old tower with a similar layout. At night, most of the windows are dark, but tonight, one window directly across from mine was lit. And in that window, someone was watching me, a man, standing motionless, just staring. I blinked, leaned closer, trying to make out his face. He raised his hands slowly and waved. I jerked back from the window, heart pounding. I scrambled for my phone, dialing building security. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. Then, a ping, an email from an address I didn't recognize. "You work too late. You should go home." I stared at the screen, frozen. Then came a second ping. A message on Slack. "Private, anonymous. I'm already on your floor." I stood up, adrenaline crashing through my body. I could hear footsteps again. Closer this time. Not cautious, confident. I grabbed my bag and darted out of my office, running for the elevators. I pressed the button over and over, eyes locked on the hallway behind me. The footsteps stopped, then started again. I bolted for the stairwell. I took the stairs 2 at a time, heart in my throat. The sound of the door opening echoed above me. Someone had entered the stairwell. I didn't look back, just ran. I burst through the lobby doors out into the night, gasping for breath. The night security guard looked up, startled. "You okay?" I could barely speak. Someone was following me upstairs. I don't know who. He radioed building security, locked the lobby doors, and walked me to the parking garage. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the building manager reviewed the security footage. But something was wrong. There was no footage of the stairwell door opening, no one entering the floor, no one leaving. But I had the emails, the Slack message, the lit window across from mine. When IT checked the message logs, they found nothing. "That account doesn't exist," they said. I knew what I saw, what I heard, but there was no proof. I never stayed late again. I changed my schedule, my habits. I worked from home whenever I could. And when I had to be at the office late, someone stayed with me. But even now, sometimes I catch myself looking out that window, wondering, what would have happened if I hadn't run? What if he's still out there? And worst of all, what if he's not alone? I used to think nothing bad could ever happen in a quiet suburban park. You know the kind. Tucked neatly behind rows of white picket fences, where golden retrievers chase frisbees and toddlers waddle through sprinklers in the summer. Parents chatted lazily on benches, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves and the soft whir of bicycles passing by. Ashford Grove was the kind of place that gave off the illusion of permanence, of safety, a postcard image frozen in time. Our park was called Ashford Grove, a modest patch of green carved out behind a sleepy residential block in upstate New York. It wasn't listed in any tourist guide, and it never had more than a few families at once. But for the people who lived nearby, it was a pocket of peace in an otherwise uneventful town. It wasn't even particularly scenic. A few tired benches, their paint chipped and flaking, an old rusting swing set that squeaked on windy days, a cracked basketball court with faded lines and a bent rim where no one had played in years, a sandbox overrun with weeds and cigarette butts. But despite its wear and neglect, the place had a strange kind of charm, like it had stories buried beneath the surface. But for me, the heart of the park was the sycamore tree. It stood in the farthest corner, its limbs gnarled and heavy, stretching out like a silent guardian over the forgotten corner of the field. That's where I'd meet Lisa, my girlfriend. We'd been together for nearly 2 years. High school sweethearts turned small-town couple trying to make something of ourselves. We didn't have much, cheap dates, hand-me-down dreams, but we had each other. and we had that tree. It saw everything. Our first awkward kiss, the late night talks about leaving town, the tears, the laughter, the moments we thought nobody else would understand. Sometimes we'd just lie beneath its branches in silence, listening to the wind rattle through the leaves. I used to think that tree was eternal, that it'd stand there forever, witnessing every chapter of our lives unfold. But I was wrong. Lisa worked nights at a diner off Route 17, one of those chrome-plated relics from the 60s that never closed, its flickering neon sign buzzing like a dying firefly in the dark. She hated the uniform, stiff collar, checkered apron, but she wore it with a grace I always admired. I had a job at a gas station just a few blocks away, graveyard shift, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was chasing off a raccoon or counting pennies for truckers too tired to care. After our shifts, when the streets emptied out and porch lights blinked out one by one, we'd meet at the park. It didn't matter how tired we were or how cold the night air bit through our jackets, we'd show up, even if it was just for 15 minutes. Even if our breath fogged in front of us like smoke, even if neither of us had anything new to say. Those nights felt sacred, like the world shrank due. It started small. I noticed him first, a figure, always at a distance, standing beneath the busted street lamp at the park entrance, sometimes smoking, sometimes not. He never moved, never came closer, just watched. I thought it was nothing, a local drunk, a guy waiting for a ride, maybe a night jogger resting. Lisa didn't even notice him at first, and when she did, she just shrugged. But he kept showing up, every night. I began to dread going to the park. Lisa, ever the optimist, thought I was being paranoid. He's just lonely, she said. Maybe the park's his quiet place too. But something about him unsettled me. He never flinched, never spoke. His presence was oppressive, even from afar. Some nights I swore he was closer than the last, watching us from the shadow of a tree or the edge of the court. I considered going to the cops, but what would I say? Some guy standing in a park? It wasn't illegal, and it wasn't like he was doing anything, but the way he stared, it felt like a warning. Then, Lisa stopped showing up. The first night she didn't come, I assumed she was tired. The second night, I waited 2 hours under the sycamore, frozen and worried. I called. No answer. Texts unread. I went by her place, empty. I asked her coworkers. They said she left work on time, smiling. Usual Lisa. I called hospitals. Nothing. The cops thought it was a lover's spat. She'll turn up, they said. But I knew better. I knew something was wrong. On the fourth day, I found something under the sycamore tree. A photo. Crisp, new, of Lisa. She was sitting on our bench, smiling, wearing the coat I gave her last Christmas. The same coat she wore the last night we met, but I hadn't taken that photo. And I sure as hell wasn't in it. Someone else was. In the blurry corner, a man in a hoodie, not looking at her, looking at the camera. I started digging. I asked around, showed the photo to everyone in town. Most just shrugged. Some looked away, uncomfortable. A few mentioned the park had always been off. One old man said his dog refused to go near the sycamore. I stopped sleeping, ate little, lost my job. My life condensed into this obsession. I needed to find her. I had to. That's when I remembered the cameras. The diner had a security system, and the park had an old city-funded CCTV on the main path. I filed every request, called every contact, begged. What I saw changed everything. Lisa left the diner at 12:03 a.m. as always, smiling, waving to her coworker. She took the usual path through the alley behind the laundromat, shortcut to the park. At 12:11 a.m., the city camera caught her entering Ashford Grove. At 12:12 a.m., it cut to static. That feed didn't return until 12:37 a.m. When it did, the park was empty. I broke into the park one night. Tools, flashlight, adrenaline. I don't know what I was looking for. A sign, a clue, a body. What I found was worse. Near the base of the sycamore, I noticed the soil was unusually soft, fresh. I dug. Inches down, I found wood, a hatch, old metal reinforced, locked. I pried it open. A ladder descended into darkness. I still hear her voice, in the recordings, in my dreams, sometimes in static. What was beneath the park was a room, concrete, crude, a mattress, chains and photos, hundreds of photos, of Lisa, of me, of others, some smiling, some screaming. There were tapes too, but I haven't watched them all. I can't. The man in the hoodie was real. He had been watching for years. Not just us, others too. He knew our patterns, our routines. He lived beneath our lives, in the silence between footsteps. The police came. The case made the news. But Lisa, she's still missing. Officially. Unofficially, I think I'm the only one who still looks. I go back sometimes, just sit under the sycamore, listen to the wind. And sometimes I think I hear footsteps behind me, but I never turn around. It was the spring of 2011. I was 8 years old, living with my parents and younger sister in a modest one-story house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon. Life was simple back then. The streets were lined with tall maples. Every neighbor knew each other by name, and kids still played outside until the porch lights flicked on. Our backyard was my kingdom, my fortress of solitude, my stage for adventure. It was fenced in with weathered wooden panels, and the perimeter was lined with towering oak trees that rained leaves in the fall and cast long, dappled shadows in the spring. To my young eyes, it seemed like an endless world of possibility. I spent countless afternoons out there, racing squirrels across the lawn, collecting acorns, and fashioning forts out of sticks, tarp, and my mom's old bedsheets. I'd dig tiny trenches with my plastic shovel and imagine I was a soldier in a far-off battle. Other times I was a spy, crawling through the grass on my belly, or a superhero scaling the fence to save imaginary civilians. There was something magical about the way the light filtered through the trees, and how the breeze whispered secrets through the leaves. I could lose hours out there, completely immersed in my imaginary worlds. Looking back, everything seemed ordinary. Happy, even. A golden slice of childhood. But there's one memory that won't leave me alone, no matter how many years have passed. Something happened in that backyard. Something I didn't fully understand at the time. Now, more than a decade later, I can finally admit it. It still haunts me. Behind our backyard fence, about 30 yards away, there was a thick patch of woods. It wasn't a park or a trail, just a wild tangle of overgrown brush and gnarled trees that seemed to go on forever. Even in daylight, the canopy was dense enough to cast a gloom over the undergrowth, and at night, it became a black wall that swallowed sound and light. The wind barely stirred the branches. It felt like a place the world had forgotten. My parents always warned me not to go near it. Too many thorns, my dad said. Ticks and poison ivy, Mom added. But there was something in their tone, an unease they never explained. They spoke quickly, almost reflexively, like they didn't want to talk about it. But I always wondered what was back there. What lay beyond the rusted chain-link fence and that wall of green and gray? It called to my curiosity like a whisper, always just out of reach. Sometimes I'd stand on a cinder block and press my face against the slats in the fence, peering through the cracks. I'd wait and watch for movement. Occasionally, I saw deer or raccoons darting between the trees, their eyes flashing in the dim light. Once I swore I saw a fox, its red fur disappearing into the shadows. I used to imagine secret hideouts, buried treasure, even ancient ruins hidden beneath the moss. But most days it was just shadows, shifting, breathing. It was a sunny afternoon in late March. I was playing with my toy army figures in the grass, setting up battles and explosions only I could see. At one point, I crawled toward the back fence to retrieve a soldier that had fallen. That's when I saw him. A man. He was standing just past the tree line, partially hidden behind a trunk, staring directly at me. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just stood there, still as the bark that camouflaged him. I froze. He was tall, taller than my dad, with dark, unkempt hair and a gray hoodie. Something about his face seemed wrong. I couldn't describe it then, but now I'd say it looked empty, like it was missing something human. I scrambled backward, heart pounding, and ran inside. I told my mom what I saw. She looked up from her laptop with a soft smile. "Probably someone hiking," she said. "There are trails deeper in the woods. Don't worry, sweetie." But he was staring at me, I insisted. Dad chimed in from the kitchen. "Maybe he was looking at a deer or something." "You're fine, bud. Just stay in the yard, okay?" I nodded, but something about the way they dismissed it made me feel worse. Like I was completely alone in what I saw. Like it didn't matter. And the worst part, he came back. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things. Twigs snapped just beyond the fence. Faint movement among the trees. Once, I found one of my toy soldiers propped up against the fence, facing the woods, even though I hadn't left it there. Then one afternoon, I saw him again. Same spot, same stare. I didn't scream this time. I just slowly backed away and went inside. I didn't even tell my parents. What was the point? But that night, I locked my bedroom window. It became a strange routine. I'd go outside, pretending to play like normal, but my eyes were always on the tree line, watching, waiting. Sometimes, I'd see nothing. Other times, I'd catch the faintest glimpse of him. Always distant, always still. He never crossed the fence. Never made a sound. But he was there. I could feel it. I stopped playing near the back of the yard. I stopped sleeping with the window open. At school, I was distracted, jumpy. I didn't want to be home alone, even in the middle of the day. And then something happened that made everything worse. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I went outside and noticed something strange in the mud near the fence. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were large, far too big for an 8-year-old. And they weren't along the outside of the fence. They were inside. My stomach dropped. I followed them with my eyes. They led from the back fence toward the side of the house and then disappeared. I told my dad. He came out, looked at the prints, and frowned. "Probably a neighbor checking for a lost pet," he muttered. "Or maybe the gardener." We didn't have a gardener. After that, my parents started locking the gate to the backyard. They installed a motion light and trimmed the hedges, but they never admitted anything was wrong. They never said, "We believe you." But I think they knew. Because my dad started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed, and my mom started double-checking the doors every night. I stopped going outside altogether. I didn't see him again, not clearly at least, but I knew he was still there. I could feel him, watching. And then, one day, he was gone. I don't know why. Maybe we scared him off, maybe he got bored, maybe something worse happened and he never got the chance to come back. I never found out who he was. The police were never involved. Nothing ever happened, officially, but I never forgot. Now I'm 20, in college, living in a different state. But sometimes when I'm walking home late or sitting in my apartment alone, I think about him. That man. Standing in the woods, watching a little boy play. And I wonder what he wanted, why he never spoke, why he never crossed the fence, and whether somewhere he's found a new fence to stand behind. Hospitals aren't supposed to be quiet. Even in the dead of night, there's a rhythm to them, a kind of mechanical heartbeat. The muffled scuff of sneakers on tile floors, the distant hum of a ventilator, the sudden flatline alarm from a nearby room, followed by hurried footsteps and terse voices. The sound of life being monitored, managed, and, when necessary, fought for. But not in Wing C. Not where I was sent. There, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. I'm a medical intern at St. Alden's Regional Hospital, a cold, concrete fortress tucked into a forgotten corner of northern Pennsylvania. The kind of place people drive past without noticing. its facade hidden behind decades of grime and overgrown hedges. It's massive, sprawling across too many acres, built during a time when optimism ran unchecked and state budgets were bloated with hope. The coal industry was supposed to bring life and prosperity here. It didn't. The towns shriveled, and the hospital with them. Now, half of St. Albans is abandoned. Some wings sit in a permanent state of under-renovation, with plastic sheets flapping like ghosts in the drafty hallways. Others are sealed off entirely behind chained double doors and warning signs about asbestos, mold, or unstable flooring. Everyone pretends the hospital is still whole, but it's not. It's a decaying shell with a functioning heart and dying limbs. Wing C was one of those limbs. Officially closed since a fire in 1998 scorched a portion of the East Corridor and left several rooms uninhabitable. Rumors around the hospital hinted at more than structural damage. Whispers of misfiled reports, missing records, patients who vanished without discharge. Nothing I could verify. But this year, a sudden spike in patient volume forced the administration to make a call. Reopen a portion of Wing C. Just one hallway, just 10 rooms, just overnight observation cases. And they needed someone to cover it. So, they sent me. Narrow. The kind of hallway that seems to stretch farther than it should, like it's been quietly growing when no one's looking. Every step I took echoed back at me with unnatural sharpness, like the walls were listening. The floors were covered in this ugly brown linoleum, scuffed, peeling in places, and always vaguely sticky underfoot, no matter how many times it had been mopped. The walls were a faded yellow, stained and cracked, the color of old teeth left too long in a glass of tea. In places, the plaster bulged slightly, like something underneath was trying to push out. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed with that high-pitched whine you can feel in your skull more than hear, flickering sporadically in a rhythm that felt almost intentional. It smelled like cleaning chemicals, yes, but not the crisp sterility of a freshly scrubbed surgical room. No, it was the sour tang of ammonia barely masking deeper odors. Old sweat, damp plaster, burnt plastic, and something else, something metallic, something that clung to the back of your throat long after you'd left. 9 rooms were active, basic overnight care, low traffic, low attention. But the 10th room, room 210, was different. It was always locked. No one ever mentioned it, not once during orientation, not during shift briefings. When I asked the charge nurse, she didn't even blink, just muttered, "Storage," in a tone that was far too brisk, too practiced, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask and already had her lie ready. From then on, I noticed the way other staff avoided that end of the hall, how they sped up when walking past it, eyes fixed straight ahead, how no one lingered near the door, and every time I passed it, something in my chest would tighten, a pressure behind the ribs. Like the air there was thicker, heavier, like someone was standing just on the other side of the door, leaning close, listening. Most of the patients were low risk. Elderly folks recovering from minor surgeries, people with respiratory problems needing overnight observation, the occasional detox case. Quiet people, tired people. But they all said the same thing after a few nights in the hallway. They couldn't sleep. They heard things, footsteps, knocking, whispered conversations. One old woman, Mrs. Hargraves, said she saw a man in white standing at the end of the hallway at 3 a.m. every night. Just standing, watching. We checked the cameras, nothing. She was moved to another ward the next day, and within 24 hours, she was sleeping fine. My shift started at 11 p.m. I'd check vitals, log entries, administer meds. By 2 a.m., things usually settled down. The hallway would go still. That was when I'd take my break. Coffee from the vending machine, maybe a stale granola bar, and a scroll through my phone. I started to notice patterns. Lights would flicker every night at exactly 2:13 a.m. A patient would call out at 2:17 a.m. Different patient, different reason, same time. Sometimes room 209's heart monitor would beep once, randomly, even when it was unoccupied. I reported these things. Maintenance came, found nothing. IT checked the monitors, all normal, but it wasn't normal. Not in that hallway. One night around 2:30 a.m., I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A soft knock. 3 short taps, coming from room 210. I froze outside the door, heart pounding. I knew it was locked, had always been locked. I tried the handle anyway. It turned. The door creaked open, just an inch, enough to see darkness inside. Thick, pitch-black darkness, like light itself had been swallowed. Then the door slammed shut, hard. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rolling cart. My hands were shaking, my breath short. I stared at the door for what felt like an hour. I didn't tell anyone. A week later, I found an old binder wedged behind the supply cabinet in the nurse's station. It was dusty, water damage, labeled simply, Wing C, Incident Reports. The earliest entry was from 1996. A nurse claimed she found a patient missing from room 210. She swore she'd seen him just hours before. No one else had him on the roster. Another report, 1997, said a new intern quit on his 3rd night. No reason given. Just left his badge and a one-line note, "Something's wrong with the hallway." The final entry was from January 1998. Unexplained fire. Origin unknown. All staff accounted for. 1 patient unregistered, presumed deceased. I decided I wasn't leaving that hallway until I understood what was happening. I brought a small camera and placed it at the far end of the corridor, facing room 210. I sat just outside the door with my notebook, a flashlight, and enough caffeine to keep me up till dawn. Nothing happened until 2:13 a.m. The lights buzzed, flickered. My camera feed glitched. I stared at the screen as a figure stepped into frame. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. It moved slowly toward room 210, then stopped, turned. Faced the camera. No face, just a blur. I looked up, nothing there. The next morning I was called into HR. A patient had gone missing. Room 208, no explanation, no footage, no record of discharge. They asked me questions, too many, their eyes narrow, their voices tight. I wasn't fired, but I was reassigned to a different ward, day shift. Wing C was closed again, quietly, no announcement. Just sealed off, like it never existed. I kept the journal and the footage. I tried to contact some of the staff who worked there in the 90s. Most didn't respond. A few had died. One, an old janitor, answered my email. We spoke once. He said only one thing before hanging up. It wasn't a fire. Not really. It's been 4 years. I'm no longer at St. Alden's. I moved states. I don't work in hospitals anymore. But sometimes I wake at 2:13 a.m., heart racing. Like I'm still there. Like I never left. And sometimes, in that half second between sleep and wakefulness, I hear it. 3 short knocks from the other side of the door. I used to think burnout was something that happened to other people. The kind of folks who didn't plan ahead or didn't know how to say no. But by the time I hit my 3rd month at the consulting firm, I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating right. I barely recognized the face in the mirror. 23 years old, freshly graduated, and already I felt like I was falling apart. The hours were brutal. The pressure was constant. My phone never stopped vibrating. Meetings bled into emails, which bled into more work, which I took home every night. Somewhere between the 3rd all-nighter and the client call that left me shaking, I knew something had to give. And if it wasn't the job, it was going to be me. So I left. Not permanently. I didn't quit, just paused. I told my boss I needed time off, and to my surprise, he didn't argue. I guess he could see it too. I booked a cabin upstate, off-grid. No Wi-Fi, no reception, just a wooden box in the middle of the forest with a fireplace and a stocked kitchenette. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The drive took longer than expected. The last hour was all narrow, winding roads, lined with pine trees so tall they blocked out the sun. I didn't pass a single car. My GPS lost signal 10 miles before the cabin. I found it by following hand-drawn directions printed off weeks ago. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The place was small, but cozy. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, and a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. No electricity, just solar panels for lights and a radio. A single window faced east, overlooking the slope of the hill and the tree line below. I unpacked slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to ease. For the first time in months, I didn't have to respond to anyone. I didn't have to do anything. It was quiet, blissfully so. That first night, I slept like I hadn't in years. The days blended together quickly. I'd wake up with the light, make coffee on the gas stove, and take long walks along the trails nearby. I'd read for hours by the window, scribble in a journal I hadn't touched since college, and sometimes just sit outside, listening to the wind sift through the trees. I was alone, and I liked it. By the fourth morning, I started to feel like myself again. I ate better, I moved more, I stopped waking up in a panic. But that morning, I noticed something strange. My coffee mug was on the wrong side of the table. I always left it on the left. I'm left-handed. That morning, it was on the right. Small thing. I blamed it on myself. Maybe I was tired the night before. I didn't think much of it. The next morning, it was the salt shaker. I kept it beside the stove, always. I even made a note in my journal about how its wooden top matched the cabin's rustic vibe. But that morning, it was on the window ledge. Then came the chair. I left it pushed in after dinner. The next day, it was pulled halfway out, angled toward the front door. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but something was off. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. I was alone in the woods, with nothing but my thoughts. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I wanted something to be wrong. But I started locking the door at night. It was just after midnight when I heard it. A creak. Not loud, just one short sound like weight shifting on old wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, staring into the darkness. The cabin was pitch black, except for the moonlight spilling through the window. I waited, listened. Nothing. The next morning, the frying pan was out, lying on the counter. I hadn't touched it in 2 days. I needed to know if I was losing it. So I set up my phone to record overnight. Just propped it up on the table, pointed toward the kitchen. I figured if anything moved, I'd see it. If not, I could confirm it was all in my head. The footage showed nothing until 3:41 a.m. Then, the salt shaker slid 2 inches to the left. No sound, no shadow, just movement. I replayed the clip 10 times. Tried to explain it, tilted surface, vibration, wind, but nothing made sense. The windows were shut, the table was solid, something moved it. After that, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up every night, lights off, waiting to hear something. Some nights were quiet. Others, I heard footsteps outside. Once, I thought I saw a shadow past the window. I stopped leaving the cabin, stopped cooking. I ate crackers and canned beans, too scared to turn my back to the room. I kept the phone recording every night. Every night, something changed. A book moved. A fork shifted. Once, the front door handle jiggled. I decided to leave. I packed a bag at dawn and started walking the road out. But after half a mile, I realized I wasn't alone. I kept hearing footsteps behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they followed. I never saw anyone, but I never stopped hearing them. I walked for hours until I reached a ranger station. They let me call a ride back to the city. I moved apartments, got a new job, a slower one. I don't talk about the cabin. I deleted the videos, but I never stopped locking my doors, never stopped checking the salt shaker. Sometimes I wake up and the chair by my desk is pulled out just a little. I don't know what it was. A person, an animal, a breakdown. All I know is this: something was there. In the quiet, watching, waiting, moving. And I'm not sure it ever really left, because every now and then when I wake up too early, I find something small, just slightly out of place. A reminder that I'm still not alone. It started as a tradition. Every Friday night, like clockwork, after our shifts ended, my friends and I would gather at Sal's Diner, a 24-hour relic sitting on the edge of town like it had been plucked from a forgotten movie set. The food wasn't anything to write home about. Greasy burgers dripping with too much cheese, fries that tasted like they'd been fried 3 times, and coffee that somehow managed to taste burnt and watery at the same time. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the atmosphere. Cracked red vinyl booths that squeaked when you slid in, a flickering neon sign buzzing in the window, and a jukebox permanently stuck on a loop of 90s hits. Sal's wasn't perfect, but it was ours. There were 5 of us that night. Me, Eric, Danny, Rochelle, and Mia. A mixed bag of personalities and paths, all connected by exhaustion, sarcasm, and loyalty. Rochelle was grinding it out in retail, constantly complaining about her manager. Eric and I worked in the same warehouse, pulling 12-hour shifts that left our hands blistered. Mia was juggling clinical rotations and exams in nursing school, and Danny never lasted more than 2 weeks in a job, but always had a story to tell. That night, we were all running on fumes, but we craved the routine, the sanctuary of familiar faces and food. It was the kind of friendship born not from parties or vacations, but from shared wariness, cheap jokes, and the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. We parked in Lot 9, a dimly lit patch of cracked asphalt behind the diner that always smelled faintly of oil and damp leaves. It was technically overflow parking, bordered by a rusted chain-link fence on one side and an alleyway that led to who knew where on the other. The few light posts that lined the lot were half dead. 2 flickered constantly like they were arguing with the darkness, and the rest had long since gone out. Still, it was free, and Sal never minded if we used the kitchen door to sneak in the back. We didn't think twice about the shadows then. It was familiar, routine. We joked that the place looked like a horror movie set, but it had never been anything more than a running gag. That night, we slid into our usual booth in the back corner, the one with the cracked window and wobbly table. Mia was mid-rant about a patient who had tried to fake a seizure for attention. Danny, of course, kept chiming in with unhelpful, sarcastic medical tips. Tell him to drink Sprite and walk it off, while Rochelle wheezed with laughter until she nearly choked on her milkshake. Everything felt normal, warm, safe. But outside the diner windows, Lot 9 was unusually still. Too still. For now, I stepped out halfway through the meal to grab my phone charger from the car. As soon as I opened the back door, I felt it. Something was off. It wasn't the air or the cold or the quiet. It was the way the shadows in the lot didn't seem still anymore. Then I heard it. A metallic clink, then a muffled voice, then a low grunt. I froze, standing just beyond the corner of the diner, hidden by a rusted-out dumpster. 2 guys were hunched over a car near the edge of the lot, Danny's car. One of them had a tool in his hand, something long and thin. The other was glancing around, nervous. They were trying to steal it. I ducked back into the diner, pulse racing. I told the others in a low voice. Danny jumped up. "Are you sure it was my car?" "Positive," I said. 2 of them. Hoodies, working fast. Eric cursed under his breath. Rochelle grabbed her phone. Mia looked like she wanted to run out and confront them. We argued. Call the cops? Go out there? Stay put? In the end, Danny and Eric decided to confront them. "It's my damn car," Danny said. "They're not getting away with it." I didn't like it, but I followed. We stepped out together. The cold hit us instantly, but adrenaline kept us warm. Danny walked ahead, shoulders squared, Eric beside him. "Hey," Danny shouted. "Get the hell away from my car." The 2 figures jumped. One of them dropped the tool. The other turned toward us, face partially hidden under a beanie. They didn't run. Not yet. "We're just looking for something we dropped," one of them muttered. "Cut the crap," Eric snapped. "You're trying to jack the car." That's when I saw the third guy. He stepped out from behind a nearby van, taller than the others. Quiet. His eyes didn't leave us. He had something in his hand. I couldn't tell what. Back off, the tall one said. Calm. Cold. Danny took a step forward. You want to fight? Let's fight. I grabbed his arm. Don't. Look at his hand. It was a tire iron. The shorter guy pulled something from his jacket, something glinting. I couldn't breathe. Mia had followed us out and was already dialing 911. Rochelle was standing at the diner door, frozen. We were outnumbered and outmatched. Then the diner door slammed open. Sal, yes, old man Sal, stepped out, holding a shotgun like he knew how to use it. Drop it? He barked. The three guys froze. The tall one's jaw tightened. Go, he said. And just like that, they took off. Hopped into a black SUV parked at the edge of the lot and sped off, tires screeching. Sal lowered the gun, looked at us, and muttered, "Idiots." The cops came 10 minutes later. We gave statements, descriptions. They said the crew had hit 2 other lots that week. Probably pros, probably armed. You're lucky, one officer told us. That could have gone real bad. No one said much after that. We sat in the booth, staring at our cold food. Sal brought us coffee on the house. Danny just kept shaking his head. They were going to steal my car. My piece of crap car. No one laughed. We never parked in Lot 9 again. Hell, we didn't go to Sal's for a while. When we did, we parked right out front under the lights. That night changed something in us. The way we saw shadows, the way we moved through the world. We were careful, alert, and we never forgot the sound of that tire iron scraping pavement. It's been 5 years since that night. We're scattered now, different cities, different lives, but every now and then I think about Sal's diner, Lot 9, the sound of that voice saying back off, and I wonder, what if Sal hadn't come out? What if we hadn't seen them? What if we hadn't gone out at all? It's not a ghost story, not a campfire tale, but it haunts me just the same. I've been driving trucks for the better part of 10 years. Cross-country hauls, long nights, diner food that tastes like cardboard, and gas station coffee that could melt steel. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. You either get used to the solitude or it eats you alive. Me? I came to crave it. The long stretches of highway where civilization thins out and your only companion is the dull hum of rubber on asphalt. The darkness out there isn't empty, it's peaceful. On the night it happened, I was hauling a refrigerated trailer packed with seafood from Portland to Denver. Tight schedule. Too tight. I'd been behind the wheel since sunrise, and by the time I crossed into Wyoming, my knuckles were white, and my eyelids felt like they had weights tied to them. My logbook said I had another hour left in me, but the real-world gauge, the one in my gut, told a different story. Around 9 p.m., the weather turned. First came the wind, whipping across the plains hard enough to rock the trailer. Then the rain, slamming down in sheets, and finally, the fog. Thick, choking fog that swallowed the high beams like a curtain. The road signs vanished. The horizon disappeared. Every turn felt like a guess. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign through the mist. Bluebird Motel, vacancy. The place looked like it hadn't had a visitor in a decade. The sign buzzed erratically, casting a sickly pink hue across the wet asphalt. Paint peeled from the siding. A few of the carports looked partially collapsed, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. What I needed was simple. A place to sleep where the roof didn't leak and the bed wasn't the driver's seat. So I turned off the highway and pulled in. The lobby was tiny. A dusty counter, an unplugged coffee machine, and a faded map of the United States on the wall. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, thick glasses and a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar. He didn't smile. "You want a room?" he asked, like I was inconveniencing him. "Yeah, just for the night." He slid a metal key across the counter. Actual key, not a card, with a cracked plastic tag that read 103. "Checkout's at 10. "Don't leave your rig running," he said, then disappeared into the back room without another word. Room 103 smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. The carpet was stained, the lamp flickered when I turned it on, and the mattress felt like it was stuffed with newspapers. But I didn't care. I was too tired. I tossed my duffel on the chair, kicked off my boots, and collapsed onto the bed. The rain kept coming, now tapping steady against the window. It should have been relaxing. Instead, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Closed the blinds, turned off the light. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. sharp, not groggy, not confused, just wide awake. The room was dark, the rain had stopped, and it was silent. No hum from the fridge, no wind outside, not even the creak of the building settling. Just absolute stillness. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate. Not on the door, on the wall, the one between my room and the vacant room next door. I stayed still, held my breath, waited, nothing. I eventually fell back asleep. But the next morning, something was off. My duffel bag had been moved. Just a little. Maybe I bumped it, maybe not. I went to the front desk to ask about the room next door. "There's someone in 104?" I asked casually. The manager looked up from his crossword. "No, been empty all week." "You sure? I thought I heard something last night." He narrowed his eyes at me. "This place is old. You hear all kinds of creaks and groans." He went back to his puzzle. Conversation over. I should have left. I told myself I would after a nap, but I was still so damn tired. That night, I wedged a chair under the doorknob, put my keys under the pillow, locked the window. I slept fitfully. Woke up twice, gasping like I'd been holding my breath. At 2:17 a.m., I woke again. This time, the room was colder. No knocks, but the bathroom light was on. I hadn't turned it on. Morning came. I opened the connecting door to room 104. It wasn't locked. The room looked untouched. Clean, even. Bed made. TV unplugged. But the air was stale, like it hadn't been opened in months. In the closet, I found a jacket. Inside the pocket, a wallet. The license belonged to a man named Jerry L. Hammond. Issued in 2003. Expired in 2005. I brought the wallet to the manager. Told him what I found. He took one look and said, "That's not possible." I pressed him. He finally admitted there was a driver named Jerry who stayed in room 103 years ago. Never checked out. His rig sat in the lot for 2 days before they towed it. Police investigated, but nothing came of it. He was just gone. I didn't sleep that third night. I stayed in my rig with the doors locked. At 2:17 a.m., I looked toward the motel. Room 103's light flicked on, then off. I drove out at dawn. Didn't stop for 3 hours. When I finally pulled over at a truck stop, I checked my duffel. Inside, neatly folded, was Jerry's jacket. It's been months. I asked around, other drivers. A few had heard of the Bluebird Motel. Most hadn't. But one guy, older, leaned in close when I mentioned it. "You stayed in 103? I nodded. He didn't say anything, just shook his head, slow and sad. I still drive nights, still sleep in the cab more often than not. But every once in a while, I get a room. And every time I do, I check the wall at 2:17 a.m. Because sometimes I still hear the knock." I've lived in Boston my whole life. The city's in my bones, the noise, the weather, the rhythm. And like every other local who's tired of crawling through traffic and hemorrhaging cash on downtown parking, I rely on the T. Specifically, the Red Line. That rumbling, screeching metal snake has carried me through high school, college, internships, dead-end jobs, and everything in between. It became part of me. Same car, same seat if I could get it. Same playlist every morning. Headphones in. Hood up, mind off. The tunnel lights would flicker past like blinking memories, the dull voice over the speaker barely registering. I've ridden the Red Line so many times, I knew the rhythm of the stops by heart. When to brace for the lurch, when to hold my breath by that one weird smelling vent. I could have navigated it blindfolded. Nothing ever felt strange or unusual about it. It was a machine, predictable, safe in its monotony. Until that morning in April, when the machine slipped. It was a Tuesday, one of those New England mornings where the sky feels like wet concrete and the damp clings to your bones. I remember it clearly because I stepped straight into a puddle outside the station that soaked through my sneaker and turned my sock into a sponge. Every squelching step down the platform felt like a personal insult. I grumbled my way through the turnstiles, boarded the red line at Central, and grabbed my usual spot by the window. The train was packed enough to feel stuffy but quiet, commuters locked in their little worlds of podcasts and scrolling thumbs. I pulled my hoodie tight, blasted a familiar playlist, and stared blankly at my reflection in the glass. Just another commute. Until it wasn't. Somewhere between Central and Kendall, the train should have made its usual left curve. It always did. A predictable, subtle lurch that I knew better than I knew my own schedule. But this time, it didn't turn. The train stayed straight, the rhythm shifted, and my stomach twisted in recognition before my brain caught up. I glanced around. Nobody flinched. Heads were bowed, eyes glazed, everyone lost in their own little fog. But I knew this line like I knew the beat of my heart, and this curve didn't belong. The train slowed as it entered a tunnel I had never seen before. The walls were darker, not the usual grimy gray, but deep, soot-stained black. The fluorescent lights along the side flickered and then died completely. For maybe 10 seconds, the car was lit only by the emergency bulbs. That was when the train stopped. Not at a station, not anywhere on the map. The doors didn't open, the lights didn't come back. There was no announcement, just silence. I looked around. There were only 3 other people in the car with me. An old man in a Patriots hat, a young woman tapping away at her phone, and a teenager with headphones. None of them looked up. I pressed the button near the door. Nothing. I tried calling out, no response. Then I noticed something. The old man was staring straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing. The girl's screen wasn't even lit, and the teenager's headphones weren't plugged in. I realized, slowly and with a cold sinking in my chest, that I might be the only person truly conscious in that car. And then the doors opened. It wasn't a station, not a real one. The platform was narrow, with walls of unfinished concrete. No signs, no advertisements, no safety strip, just raw cement and hanging wires. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the train. No one else moved. The tunnel air was thick, musty, the kind of smell that clings to forgotten places. I called out again, my voice echoed too far. Then, behind me, the door shut. The train groaned, then began to move again. I was alone. I walked the length of the platform. No emergency phones, no maps, no stairs, only a maintenance door at the far end. It wasn't locked. Beyond it was a corridor, low-ceilinged, lined with old utility pipes and decaying insulation. My footsteps echoed oddly, like the tunnel wasn't empty. I kept moving. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. Curiosity? Stupidity? I don't know. I followed the corridor until I found something that didn't belong. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with no windows, and only a single humming fluorescent light overhead. The walls were bare concrete blocks, cold and damp to the touch. The air was heavy, stale like a basement that hadn't been opened in years. In the middle of the room stood a metal table, its surface cluttered with photographs. Dozens. No, hundreds. They were scattered across the table in messy piles, pinned to corkboards leaning against the walls, even taped haphazardly to the cinder blocks. All of people. Different angles, different eras. Some photos were blurred and grainy like they'd been captured in motion or enlarged beyond clarity. Others were sharp and clear, almost professionally framed. Some were in color, some in black and white. All taken in subway stations. I saw images from South Station, Park Street, even Harvard Square. Some I recognized, some I didn't, and then I saw it. In the center of the back wall was a photo of me, fresh, crisp, taken from behind, my red hoodie, my earbuds, my exact stance from that morning, pinned with a single rusted tack, perfectly centered. A chill clawed its way down my spine. I heard them then, heavy, measured, echoing against the concrete walls like they were getting closer with purpose. My throat tightened. I reached for the photo, ripped it down without thinking, and sprinted out of the room. My sneakers slapped the tunnel floor, heartbeat in my ears louder than the steps behind me. Back through the corridor, past the sagging pipes and crumbling insulation. Across the platform, which now felt twice as wide and infinitely more exposed. I reached the wall where the train had once been, pounded my fists against the concrete. Nothing. No train, no vibration, no escape. Then I ducked into the shadows behind a stack of loose conduit coils, breathing as softly as I could. The footsteps drew nearer. Paused. I swore I could hear breathing, low, steady, like whoever it was just waiting. Then finally they faded, one step at a time, as if whoever had been there wanted me to know they were leaving. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I tried to report it. Transit authority said there's no such tunnel, no stop between Central and Kendall. I checked maps, blueprints, archives, nothing. Even the photo vanished. I swear I had it in my backpack. Gone. I've never taken the red line since. It's been 3 years. Sometimes I think I dreamed it, but then I hear of someone disappearing on the T. A friend mentions a strange detour, a whisper on Reddit. I know that tunnel is real. I know someone or something is watching. I just don't know what they want, and I pray I never find out. I wasn't looking for work when the call came. In fact, I had just left my last job 2 weeks earlier after a blown-out argument with my foreman over safety violations no one seemed to care about. I was tired of being ignored, tired of putting my neck on the line for people who only saw numbers on a clipboard. So when a guy named Trent called, said he was assembling a crew to assess an old mine in southern Utah, I hesitated. He said it was a short contract. Good pay, private client. All we had to do was survey the tunnels, document any remaining equipment, and check for potential salvage. No digging, no explosives, just a walkthrough with headlamps and clipboards. I should have said no. We were 6 in total. Trent, who wore mirrored sunglasses even underground, was the project lead. Then there was Dell, a quiet guy in his 50s who'd spent his life around mines. Maria, a structural engineer from New Mexico. Jamal, a green geology student who looked like he'd never lifted a shovel. And Andy, my old drinking buddy from a copper site in Arizona. Familiar face. Too familiar. We met at a gas station near a ghost town called Emery's Pass. From there, we followed a dirt road up into the hills. The mine hadn't been operational since 1984. The land had been bought and sold a dozen times. Supposedly it was clean, no collapses, no toxic leaks, no bodies. That was the official line. The entrance was carved into the side of a hill, surrounded by sun-bleached timber and rusted scaffolding. The air was dry, sharp with the scent of iron and dust. We set up a small base camp outside, tents, water, supplies, radios, and began logging our movements on a clipboard. Inside, the mine was cooler, quieter. Every footstep kicked up old dust that clung to our boots. The deeper we went, the less the outside world seemed to exist. The light dimmed to what our headlamps could touch. Our voices echoed back at odd angles. There was graffiti from the 80s, old boot prints still preserved in the dust, and broken lanterns long since gone cold. It was like walking into someone else's memory. Maria had a layout of the tunnels printed on thick, yellowing paper, clearly a copy of the original records. As she unfolded it under the beam of her headlamp, her brow furrowed almost instantly. What we found didn't line up. There were entire shafts that weren't marked. Hallways that were supposed to be sealed were open, and worse, there were doors. Heavy metal ones, welded shut or bricked over with no explanation on the map. Trent waved it off, saying the mine's documentation had been a mess for years. But Maria didn't buy it. I could see her hands tighten around the clipboard, her usual confidence replaced by something colder, calculating, like she was trying to solve a problem she hadn't expected to face. That's when we decided to split into pairs to cover more ground. Andy and I took the western spur, an area marked as inactive. He cracked jokes the whole way down, trying to lighten the mood, but there was a tightness in his smile, a stiffness in his shoulders. It wasn't just the dark pressing in. It was the silence. It had weight. Like sound didn't want to travel in these tunnels. Like we were intruding. Our boots echoed unnaturally against the rock walls. The sound swallowed too quickly. We passed by corroded ladders, crates with broken seals, and beams of support that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Not just physically, but something else. A feeling that dug under the skin. Then we found the maintenance room. A low metal door, slightly ajar. Inside was a cramped space lined with rusted lockers and a corkboard covered in curling paper. Time cards hung in a neat row, untouched. Safety memos still clipped, a half-completed crossword in pencil. Everything coated in dust, but undisturbed, as if the workers had vanished mid-shift. One locker was open, containing a faded hard hat and a metal lunchbox with a sandwich still inside, long mummified by time. Andy didn't joke anymore. Del didn't come back. He and Jamal had taken the northeast shaft, said they'd be 30 minutes. An hour passed, then 2. Trent radioed them. Static. We followed the path they'd taken. Found Jamal sitting on the ground, eyes wide, hands shaking. He kept saying, he was just there. He was right behind me. No sign of Del. Just a dropped helmet and a trail of disturbed dust that led to a wall. A wall with no exit. Trent decided to evacuate. We hiked back toward the surface, but halfway up the tunnel shook. Not violently, but enough. A minor collapse, we thought. We turned back to take the long way out. Then the radios went dead. I tried my phone. No signal, no GPS. We made camp in the main junction room. Tension was high. No one wanted to say it, but we were lost. And the mine was bigger than the maps showed. Much bigger. While scouting for a second exit, I found a metal locker sealed shut in a side tunnel. Inside was a notebook, wrapped in plastic. The entries were dated from 1983. The writer talked about hearing voices, seeing shadows, people disappearing, management shutting down parts of the mine without explanation. The last entry was scribbled, half torn. They told us not to dig here. We opened something. Maria wanted to blast the entrance. Andy thought we should conserve supplies and wait. Trent disappeared for 3 hours without telling anyone. When he came back, he wouldn't say where he'd been. Jamal refused to eat, just stared into the dark, muttering about footsteps that didn't echo. By then, none of us were sleeping. The mine groaned at night. We felt vibrations through the floor. Soft at first, then sharper. Closer. We followed a ventilation shaft and found an opening we hadn't seen before. A vast chamber, far below what the maps recorded. It wasn't natural. Perfect symmetry. Metal scaffolding, long rusted, empty crates, stamped with a logo none of us recognized. Something had been down here, moved, stored, hidden. And we weren't the first to find it. We eventually found a way out, an old service tunnel behind a rockfall. By the time we stumbled into daylight, we'd been underground for 5 days. Del was never found. Trent vanished 2 days later, left his tent and gear behind. Jamal checked himself into a psychiatric ward. Maria left the field completely. Me? I still see the mine in my dreams, still hear that echo that doesn't bounce back. And sometimes when the wind is low, I think I can still smell dust and iron. Like something old is still breathing beneath the surface. I always liked working at the Brookhaven Museum. It was small, tucked between a library and a bakery on Main Street in our sleepy New England town. The kind of place tourists stumbled into by accident and locals forgot existed. We didn't get much traffic. Maybe a few visitors on the weekends, mostly school field trips during the fall. I started working there part-time during my second year of community college. It was peaceful work, cataloging, light cleaning, unlocking the doors in the morning and locking them again at night. The artifacts were mostly from the town's early settler days. Old farming tools, faded photos, letters in glass cases. Nothing flashy, but charming in a dusty, forgotten way. I never thought the museum would be the setting for the most terrifying experience of my life. Tuesdays were my solo shifts. I'd open around 10 a.m. and close by 6. Usually I only saw 2 or 3 people the whole day. I'd eat lunch at the front desk, reading or scrolling through my phone, and keep an eye on the old security monitors that covered the handful of exhibit rooms. The cameras were ancient, black and white, grainy and prone to static, but they gave me a little peace of mind, especially when I was alone. There was a back room where we stored donations that hadn't been processed yet. Boxes of old postcards, antique trinkets, and random junk people thought was valuable. I was in there on the Tuesday, everything changed. It was around 3 p.m. The bell above the entrance rang, echoing through the empty museum. I glanced at the monitors. A man had walked in, tall, wearing a beige trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He moved slowly, stopping to look at the displays. Something about him seemed off. Not alarming, just deliberate. His movements were too slow, too focused. He never looked toward the front desk, never glanced at the cameras. I watched for a few more minutes before returning to my work. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I checked again. He was still there, still in the same room, just standing. At 5:30, I started my usual closing routine. The museum had gone eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I moved through each exhibit room methodically, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. I checked the windows, flipping off lights one by one, plunging each room into shadow as I went. When I reached the last exhibit, the one where I'd last seen the man in the trench coat, something in me tensed. The room was dim, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the dusty skylight. The figure was gone. No trace, not even the soft creak of a floorboard. I stood still for a few seconds, listening for any sign of movement. But the silence was thick, stifling. I hadn't heard the bell ring again. I always did. It was a high, distinct chime that echoed clear as day throughout the building. I quickly checked the security monitors. Static danced across the screens, the images barely discernible. I toggled through each angle. Nothing. No figure, no movement. Trying to shake the unease, I made a sweep of the rest of the museum. I opened the bathroom door slowly, half expecting to find someone standing inside. Empty. I checked the storage closet, just old boxes and cleaning supplies. I even crouched down and looked behind the big antique wardrobe that always gave me a weird feeling. Still nothing. I returned to the front, expecting, hoping the door had somehow opened and I'd just missed it. But the entry door was still locked, the bolt still turned. I tested it twice, locked. The man had never left. I stayed later than usual, shaken but not sure why. I convinced myself I must have missed him leaving. Maybe the bell didn't ring. Maybe the camera glitched. Maybe I imagined how long he'd been there. I shut everything down, grabbed my backpack and stepped outside. It was already dark. That's when I noticed the light was still on in the back hallway. I had just turned that off. I stepped back in, heart racing. The museum was silent, but something about it felt changed. I followed the light to the back hallway. The door to the archive room was ajar. I was sure I'd locked it. Inside, something sat on the table that hadn't been there earlier, a Polaroid photo. It showed me, sitting at the front desk, taken from a high angle, like from one of the upper gallery walkways, but no one had been upstairs. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. The hallway behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left the photo where it was and backed out of the room. I didn't lock up. I didn't even turn off the lights. I just walked out into the cold night and didn't stop until I was home. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I returned with my manager. I told her what happened. She laughed it off, said maybe I was overtired, said the cameras didn't show anything unusual. When we went into the archive room, the photo was gone. I checked the back hallway. Nothing. The lights were off. The door was locked. She gave me the rest of the week off. I never went back. Months later, I saw a post online, a thread about unsettling places you've worked. Someone mentioned a small-town museum, described a man in a hat who never looked at the staff, who stood for hours. Another replied, Brookhaven? No one answered. It's been 4 years. I avoid museums now, even the big ones, especially the quiet ones. I still think about that man in the hat. I wonder if he was real, if he ever left, if he ever spoke to anyone. Sometimes I dream I'm back at that front desk scrolling my phone, and when I look up, he's standing just outside the frame of the camera, waiting. It started with a deadline. I was working in a tech company in downtown Seattle, mostly back-end stuff for cloud architecture. Boring to most people, but I liked the quiet logic of it. Lately, though, the quiet was gone, replaced by pressure. Our team had fallen behind on a client migration project, and my manager asked me to stay late to catch up. So I did. 4 nights in a row. I wasn't the only one burning the midnight oil at first, but by the 4th night, I was alone. The office after dark is a strange place, familiar but off. The overhead lights stay on just enough to cast long shadows, and the usual hum of the day, typing, chatting phones, was replaced by silence broken only by the HVAC clicking on and off. I got used to the rhythm quickly. Arrive around noon, grab a coffee from the place downstairs, settle into my corner workstation, and lose myself in code until long after the sun dipped behind the Puget Sound. I took a late lunch, usually something microwaved from the break room freezer, and then kept going until 1 or 2 in the morning. There was comfort in the routine, in the predictable patterns of input and output. No meetings, no chatter, no one looking over my shoulder. The office was an open-plan setup, rows of white desks under soft LED panels, broken only by the occasional partition. During the day, it felt sterile, but at night, it took on a different character. The silence had weight. The hum of fluorescent bulbs became a kind of static lullaby. The glow from the monitors lit up my face in soft blue. The cleaning crew showed up like clockwork around 10. 2 people. One vacuumed with earbuds in, the other emptied trash bins and sprayed down tabletops. They moved quickly and barely looked up. Within 20 minutes, they were gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of lemon-scented disinfectant. After that, the building felt like mine. I would take short breaks by the window, staring out at the lights of downtown Seattle. I could see the Ferris wheels spinning slowly on the waterfront, the red pulse of a crane across the street, the occasional late-night bus crawling past on First Avenue. But on the 5th night, something felt different. The silence felt less like peace and more like waiting. Like something else was sharing it with me. It was just after 11 p.m. when I leaned back in my chair, my spine crackling from hours of hunching over the keyboard. I stood to stretch, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders, and wandered toward the break room for a soda. The hum of the vending machine was oddly loud in the silence. As I waited for the can to drop, my gaze shifted to the floor-to-ceiling windows on the far wall. Giant panes of glass that, at night, turned into towering mirrors of the office space behind me. In that reflection, lit by the dim glow of idle monitors, I saw someone. They were seated at a desk 4 rows back. Not moving, just sitting. I turned around instantly, my breath caught. No one. The chairs were all neatly pushed in. The monitors blinked in sleep mode. The space was exactly as it should be. Except when I walked over to where I'd seen the figure, the chair was pulled out. Not in a messy, haphazard way, but slightly turned, angled toward the hallway, like someone had just stood up and left quietly. I stood there a moment, listening, my ears tuned for even the faintest sound. Nothing. I tried to shake it off, figured maybe I was overtired, grabbed my soda and went back to work. Around midnight, I heard the elevator ding. That's not unusual. There's a 24-hour law firm on the floor above. But then I heard footsteps. Not just passing through. Slow. Deliberate. They stopped near the entrance to our office. I waited for the door to open. It didn't. I stood up, walked to the front lobby. Empty. No one in sight. Back at my desk, I noticed a strange pop-up on my screen. Remote session active. Someone was logged into the network. I opened the admin console. A terminal was running from an internal IP address, but one not listed on the network map. It was labeled simply Station 9. We didn't have a Station 9. I pinged it. Got a response. Tried to trace it. Blocked. Then the terminal closed itself. I pulled up the security feed from the internal cameras. Most were dark. But camera 6, focused on the server room, showed movement. A figure. Standing still. No badge swipe. No door record. Just there. I went to the server room with my phone flashlight on. It was empty. But one of the access panels was removed. Carefully. Cleanly. Like someone knew what they were doing. I decided I'd had enough. Packed my stuff. Headed to the elevators. They weren't responding. Button lit. No sound. Tried the stairwell. Locked from the inside. Emergency override didn't work. Card reader blinked red. I was trapped. I went back to my desk and started digging. There had to be a reason. Something in the logs. Something in the backups. What I found was a series of hidden directories. Encrypted. Buried deep in the root system. Inside, logs from 2 years ago, keystroke captures, audio transcripts, surveillance files, not from our systems, of our systems. Someone had been watching, listening, for years. At the bottom of one file I found a name, R. Kleiner. I remembered the name. He was an engineer. Quiet guy. Worked odd hours. One day he just didn't show up. HR said he resigned. That was 6 months ago. But in the footage, there he was on night shift, sitting exactly where I had seen the reflection. The elevators came online at 3:13 a.m. I didn't wait. I left everything, my bag, my files, my coffee mug, and walked straight out of that building. I called in sick the next day, then the next. I never went back. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and check my laptop, just to see. And once for a second, I saw a new folder appear on my desktop. Station 9. It disappeared before I could open it. I've been driving long-haul routes for almost 8 years. Just me, the highway, and the hum of the engine. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. And I've always preferred the solitude of the road over the noise of an office. There's something peaceful about the way the world blurs by under dim headlights. That night started like any other. I had a load of appliance parts bound for Nashville, and I was somewhere in the middle of rural Missouri, surrounded by nothing but 2-lane blacktop and pine trees. It was nearing midnight. The only light came from my dashboard and the occasional reflective road sign. I was getting tired, so I decided to pull over and rest for a bit. Just a quick break. 10, maybe 15 minutes. The place wasn't much, just an old, forgotten rest area off the highway that looked like it had been built decades ago and never properly maintained. Half the parking lot lights were flickering or completely dead, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. A couple of vending machines stood crookedly against a stained concrete wall, buzzing with static like they hadn't dispensed anything in years. One was covered in graffiti, the other had its glass cracked and taped over. Nearby, a faded map of Missouri was nailed to a sun-bleached wooden kiosk, its corners curling with age. The ink was so faded it was barely legible, and someone had drawn a crude smiley face with marker in the middle of the state. The restrooms were brick structures with rusted metal doors, one hanging slightly ajar, and a pungent smell even from a distance told me I wouldn't be using them. But I didn't need much. I backed my rig into a spot near the tree line, the engine ticking as it cooled. The darkness beyond the trees looked impossibly thick, as if the forest was swallowing the light whole. I rolled the window down just a crack to let in some air. The night sounds filled the cab, crickets, the faint rustle of leaves, and the occasional whoosh of a distant car. It was quiet in that heavy, isolating way only rural rest stops can be. I let my seat recline and closed my eyes, telling myself I'd just rest for a few minutes. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft but unmistakable, crunching gravel. Slow, measured. At first, I figured it was another driver stretching his legs. Nothing unusual, but the steps kept coming. Closer. I sat up, heart thudding a little harder than before. The side mirror reflected a shape. Tall, lean, walking toward my truck from the rear. I hit the lock button out of instinct. Click. The figure stopped. He just stood there. Outside my door, not moving, not knocking, not saying a word. I rolled the window back up. Slowly, trying not to look nervous. He didn't leave. He walked to the front of the truck. Out of view. I waited, watched the mirrors. Nothing. Then came a tapping. Not on the window, on the grill. Like he was touching the front of my truck, running his fingers over the metal. I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course, I sat frozen, unsure what to do. Getting out was a bad idea. Starting the engine might provoke him. I waited. The tapping stopped. 5 minutes passed. Maybe more. I didn't dare move, barely breathed. Every second stretched impossibly long, each creak of the cab or rustle from the trees outside making me flinch. Then a shape shifted past the side mirror again, heading away this time, melting into the shadows near the tree line. His gait was slow, unhurried, as if he knew I was watching but didn't care. I stayed frozen, my fingers clenched tight around the steering wheel, eyes locked on the mirror. I waited until the last trace of him vanished into the darkness. Only then did I reach for the key. The engine roared to life with a growl that shattered the silence. I flipped on the headlights. The beams cut through the parking lot like searchlights. But there was nothing. No sign of movement. No figure in the trees. Just empty pavement and the oppressive stillness of night. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the lot, gravel crunching beneath my tires. I didn't look back. My hands were slick on the wheel, shaking hard enough to rattle my elbows. I drove like something was chasing me, like he might appear again in the rear view at any second. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead. I found a truck stop 15 miles down the road, lit, busy, safe. I parked near other rigs and went inside, still trying to calm down. I told the clerk what happened. He frowned. "You were at the rest stop off 74? "Yeah." He hesitated. "You're not the first." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He glanced around. "A few months back, another guy said someone followed him there." Same description. Said the guy didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching. I slept in the truck that night, parked under a light, keys in the ignition. I didn't dream. Or if I did, I don't remember. The next day I checked the news, searched forums, found nothing official. But one Reddit thread stood out. Highway creepers. More stories. Similar. A man at rest stops, always watching, sometimes knocking, never caught. I still take long routes, still sleep in my rig, but I never stop at unlit rest areas anymore. I keep a flashlight in the door pocket, pepper spray on the dash. I always park where there are people around. I never saw that man again. But sometimes I see shapes in the mirror, just for a second. And my hand moves, instinctively, to the lock button. I think about that night more than I'd like to admit, about how calm he was, how he never touched the door, how he didn't try to break in like he was waiting for me to make the first move. It was supposed to be a break from everything, a reset button we all desperately needed. Four of us, me, Jordan, Lex, and Mateo, had been inseparable in college. Long nights in dorm rooms, shared meals, inside jokes that lasted years. But life has a way of pulling people in different directions. Careers, relationships, distance. We scattered across different cities, different time zones, only staying connected through group texts and the occasional video call. So we made a pact, one trip every year, no matter what. No partners, no work, just us. This time, after a long stretch of stress and burnout, we craved quiet. No nightlife, no screens, just trees, a fire pit, and the sound of our own breathing. Mateo found the spot. He was always the planner. It was a remote campground buried deep in the Monongahela National Forest, tucked miles from the nearest paved road. He sent a screenshot of a topo map, circled in red with a message, "No cell signal, no service." Perfect. There were no nearby towns, no ranger stations, just one narrow dirt road that twisted through thick forest and opened up to a small, grassy clearing. 2 tent pads, a rusted fire ring, and woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. It sounded ideal, like a place that time had forgotten. Exactly what we needed. The drive-in was peaceful at first. Music, snacks, the kind of conversations that only happen on road trips. But after we left the paved road, things changed. The trees grew closer, the sky disappeared, the GPS lost signal. We followed printed directions, turned left at a tree marked with a red ribbon, and finally arrived at the clearing. It was perfect. Quiet, untouched, and just isolated enough to feel like our own world. We pitched the tents, gathered wood, and by nightfall we were sitting around a crackling fire, passing a bottle and laughing over old memories. It was the last normal night. The next morning, I woke up first. The air was still, too still. No wind, no birds. I walked around stretching, trying to shake a weird tension in my chest. Lex was already up, making coffee. He asked if I'd heard anything during the night. I hadn't. He said he thought he heard footsteps outside the tents. Soft, slow, not an animal, too heavy. Jordan brushed it off. Probably a deer, he said. Mateo nodded, but Lex didn't look convinced. Later that day, we went hiking. The trails were beautiful. Green tunnels of trees and mossy rocks. But the deeper we went, the more we noticed things that didn't make sense. Stacks of stones, carvings in the bark, fresh but unrecognizable. None of us said it, but we all felt it. Something was off. That night, we kept the fire going longer. Nobody wanted to admit they were uneasy, but no one went to bed early either. Eventually, we retreated to our tents. I lay there, listening. Around 3 a.m., I woke up, not to a sound, but to a silence so absolute it pressed against my eardrums. Then I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves. Then another. Footsteps, moving between the tents. I held my breath. My hand reached for the flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. The steps stopped, right outside my tent. Morning came like a gasp, sudden and unwelcome. The chill in the air bit at my skin as I unzipped the tent and stepped into the gray dawn light, eyes still adjusting. Jordan was already up, crouched by the fire pit, staring into the cold ashes like he was trying to read something in them. His face was pale, drawn tight with unease. When he looked up at me, there was no trace of sleep in his eyes. "Someone was here," he said, voice low and hollow. I followed his gaze to the far edge of the clearing. There, pressed into the soft dirt and dew-damp grass, were footprints. Human, barefoot. The prints were fresh, clearly defined. They led from the tree line to the middle of our camp, stopped near each of our tents, and then wandered back toward the woods. We stood in silence, just staring. Then we followed them. 10 minutes into the trees, the prints continued steadily, heel to toe, clear as day. And then they stopped, mid-stride. No scuffle, no broken branches, no sign of someone turning around, just gone. Mateo was already shaking his head. Nope, no way, we're leaving, today. Lex nodded slowly. This isn't right. But Jordan crossed his arms. We're jumping at shadows. Someone was messing with us. That's it. Probably some backwoods local trying to scare off campers. Barefoot? I asked. He shrugged. People are weird. He tried to sound rational, but even he didn't look convinced. Still, he held firm. We've got 2 more nights. We came to disconnect. Let's not ruin it. Against our better judgment, we stayed. That night, we heard voices. Not close, not clear, but just on the edge of hearing, like someone talking from deep in the woods. We turned off the fire and listened. It sounded like our names. Lex called out. No answer. Then we heard laughing. Not joyful, mocking, icy. Mateo lost it. He grabbed his pack and started throwing things into it. He wanted to hike out by flashlight. Jordan calmed him down. We agreed to stay 1 more night. Just 1. In the morning, Mateo was gone. His tent was zipped shut, his gear still inside, but no sign of him. We searched for hours, yelled until our voices cracked. Left signs, markers, anything. We found nothing. Just more of those stone stacks. More of those carvings. And now, there were 4 sets of footprints. We were breaking. Jordan refused to leave without Mateo. Lex wanted to head for the car and call for help. I was caught in the middle. We argued until the sun dipped low. Then we heard something crashing through the trees, fast. We grabbed what we could and ran. We didn't stop until we hit the car. The road out felt like salvation. But when we reached the paved road, Jordan wasn't with us. It's been a year. No trace of Mateo or Jordan was ever found. Authorities searched. Dogs, drones, volunteers. Nothing. Lex doesn't talk about it. I moved cities. But sometimes late at night, I dream of the clearing. I hear my name whispered from behind trees. I wake up with dirt under my nails. I haven't been camping since. Last week I got a text from an unknown number. No message, just a photo. It was of the clearing, and in the middle of it, standing in the exact spot where our tents were 4 figures, all facing the camera, all of them barefoot. It was almost midnight when I left the office. I'd picked up an extra shift to cover for a coworker, and I was the last one out. Our building sat in the business district of a mid-sized city in Oregon. Safe enough, I thought. Clean streets, new lights, and a security guard at the front desk who waved as I passed. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was quiet. I remember checking my phone, 3 missed texts from my roommate, all asking when I'd be home. I didn't respond. I figured I'd reply once I was in the car. My car was parked on level B3, the lowest level of the garage, the one no one used unless the others were full. It was cold down there. Dim. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. One of them flickered. B3 was a concrete box, no music, no motion sensors, just wide lanes and oil stains on the ground. My car sat alone in the far corner, next to a pillar. The echo of my heels followed me as I walked. Each step sounded louder than it should have. I remember thinking it was strange how quiet it was. Even at night, garages usually had something, an engine starting, a door slamming, but there was nothing. I pulled out my keys and pressed unlock. The lights flashed once. I opened the door. That's when I heard it. It was faint, a scuff. The sound of rubber on concrete, not close, but not far enough. I paused, held my breath, waited. Nothing. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe I'd kicked a pebble. Maybe my own footsteps were bouncing oddly off the walls. I got in the car, locked the doors. Then I saw the shadow in my side mirror. It moved quickly, too quickly. Across the far end of the garage, a shape, human height, darting behind a pillar. I froze. My hand hovered over the start button. Someone was down there. I looked around. All I could see were concrete columns in dim light. I scanned the mirrors again. Nothing. I told myself it was security, a cleaner, someone with a reason to be there. But something about it felt wrong. Off. I turned on the engine. I pulled out of the space, drove slowly toward the ramp. That's when I saw it. The gate was down. It's never down. I drove up to it, rolled down the window, pressed the call button. No answer. I hit it again. Nothing. I reached for my phone. No service. I circled the garage once, thinking maybe there was another exit I'd missed. There wasn't. Every time I passed the same row of pillars, my stomach tightened. I thought I saw movement behind one of them, but it was always gone by the time I looked. I parked, turned off the lights, tried to think. I was locked in, alone, and someone else was down there. I got out, quietly. I thought maybe I could find a stairwell, a way up to the lobby. I crept along the wall, flashlight from my phone casting long, jerky shadows. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, one after the other, growing louder. I ducked behind a pillar, held my breath. They stopped, close. I could hear someone breathing. I waited until the breathing faded. Then I moved, fast. Found the stairwell, pulled the door, locked. That's when I noticed the bag, sitting neatly beside the door, a duffel, black, unzipped. Inside, gloves, zip ties, a roll of duct tape, and a phone. Not mine. I ran, back to the car, slammed the door, locked it, started the engine. Then came the knock. Not at the window, at the rear windshield. I didn't look. I threw the car into reverse, slammed the pedal. I didn't care what I hit. I backed into a pillar, threw it into drive, hit the gate full speed. It didn't budge the first time. Second time it cracked. Third time, it shattered. The police never found anyone. They checked the tapes. Most of the cameras on B3 were offline that night. Corrupted files. Malfunction, they said. I moved apartments, got a new job. I don't work late anymore. I don't park underground. And I never ignore a shadow in the mirror. It was late October when I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. I needed a break. From my job, from the city, from people. A friend had mentioned an old fire road that led to a place called Pine Hollow, somewhere deep in the Appalachians, where a decommissioned ranger station still stood. Nobody goes up there anymore, he told me. It's quiet, peaceful, good place to clear your head. That's all I wanted, so I packed up my old Jeep, loaded it with camping gear, a few days straight worth of food, and my camera. I planned to spend 3 nights off the grid. It turned into the longest 3 days of my life. The trailhead was marked by a rusted metal gate barely hanging on its hinges, its faded yellow paint flaking like dried skin. A battered Forest Service sign leaned crookedly against a tree, the letters worn to near illegibility. Beyond it, the road narrowed into a tunnel of green, the trees leaning so close they brushed against the side mirrors of my Jeep. The gravel was sparse, the packed dirt riddled with potholes and ruts from years of neglect. My tires crunched over layers of dried leaves, occasionally thudding against hidden rocks beneath the surface. The forest grew denser the farther I went. Light filtered weakly through the canopy, casting the road in a permanent dusk. I passed no trail markers, no signs of life, just the steady hum of my engine and the occasional flutter of startled birds. After nearly an hour, the road opened into a clearing. The ranger station stood crookedly on a raised foundation of moss-covered stone, its wood siding grayed with age and streaked from years of rain. The windows were boarded up unevenly, some slats missing or broken. The front door was still intact, slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze like it was breathing. Behind the building, more forest loomed. A firewatch tower rose in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the dense canopy, leaning ever so slightly like it too had grown tired of standing. I turned off the ignition, stepped out, and stretched, my joints cracking in the cold air. It was dead silent. No birds, no wind, just the forest watching. I set up my tent a short distance from the building. I didn't plan to sleep inside. I wasn't sure about the structure's condition, but I did explore it. The door creaked open with a loud groan. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with dust and age. Old maps still hung on the walls, curling at the corners. A desk sat under one of the windows, and scattered across it were notebooks, a cracked radio, and what looked like a logbook. I flipped through the pages. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, trail maintenance notes, wildlife sightings. The last entry was from 2004. It was late October when I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. I needed a break from my job, from the city, from people. A friend had mentioned an old fire road that led to a place called Pine Hollow, somewhere deep in the Appalachians, where a decommissioned ranger station still stood. Nobody goes up there anymore, he told me. It's quiet, peaceful, good place to clear your head. That's all I wanted. So I packed up my old Jeep, loaded it with camping gear, a few days straight worth of food, and my camera. I planned to spend 3 nights off the grid. It turned into the longest 3 days of my life. The trailhead was marked by a rusted metal gate barely hanging on its hinges, its faded yellow paint flaking like dried skin. A battered Forest Service sign leaned crookedly against a tree, the letters worn to near illegibility. Beyond it, the road narrowed into a tunnel of green, the trees leaning so close they brushed against the side mirrors of my Jeep. The gravel was sparse, the packed dirt riddled with potholes and ruts from years of neglect. My tires crunched over layers of dried leaves, occasionally thudding against hidden rocks beneath the surface. The forest grew denser the farther I went. Light filtered weakly through the canopy, casting the road in a permanent dusk. I passed no trail markers, no signs of life, just the steady hum of my engine and the occasional flutter of startled birds. After nearly an hour, the road opened into a clearing. The ranger station stood crookedly on a raised foundation of moss-covered stone, its wood siding grayed with age and streaked from years of rain. The windows were boarded up unevenly, some slats missing or broken. The front door was still intact, slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze like it was breathing. Behind the building, more forest loomed. A firewatch tower rose in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the dense canopy, leaning ever so slightly like it too had grown tired of standing. I turned off the ignition, stepped out, and stretched, my joints cracking in the cold air. It was dead silent. No birds, no wind, just the forest watching. I set up my tent a short distance from the building. I didn't plan to sleep inside. I wasn't sure about the structure's condition, but I did explore it. The door creaked open with a loud groan. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with dust and age. Old maps still hung on the walls, curling at the corners. A desk sat under one of the windows, and scattered across it were notebooks, a cracked radio, and what looked like a logbook. I flipped through the pages. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, trail maintenance notes, wildlife sightings. The last entry was from 2004. Suspicious noise behind cabin. Investigated. Nothing found. Will check again in morning. There was no entry the next day. That night, the forest felt heavier. I had a small fire going, my tent zipped tight behind me. I ate a cold sandwich and watched the flames dance. Then I heard it. A sharp crack in the woods, like a branch snapping underfoot. I turned toward the sound, straining to hear more. Nothing followed. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I doused the fire early and climbed into my tent. I kept a flashlight close and a hatchet just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning I found tracks, not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet. They circled my tent once, then led back toward the ranger station. I stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to rationalize, maybe a prank, someone passing through, but the nearest town was over 20 miles away. I checked the station. Nothing had changed inside. But now I noticed the logbook had been moved, slightly. I hadn't touched it since the day before. I decided to check the firewatch tower. The trail was steep, overgrown, and clearly hadn't been used in years. The climb took nearly an hour. The structure groaned as I stepped onto the first rung of the ladder. At the top, the view was incredible. Endless forest stretching to the horizon. but the interior of the tower was stripped bare. No supplies, no equipment. Just empty beer cans and a single sleeping bag rolled into the corner. Someone had been here. Recently. That night, I didn't make a fire. I stayed in the tent, flashlight in hand, every nerve on edge. The silence outside was unnerving, too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept the flashlight on low, casting soft shadows on the thin fabric walls, and sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. The sounds came again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly over leaves. They moved with an unsettling rhythm, pausing now and then, like whoever it was knew I was listening. I held my breath, afraid even the slightest sound would give away that I was awake. Then something brushed the fabric of the tent. Light, but deliberate. A hand, a stick, my skin prickled, my body frozen. I gripped the flashlight tighter, debating whether to flick it off or aim it at the wall. But I did neither. I stayed still, perfectly still. Then silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the thick, weighted kind where you know something is still there. Waiting, just beyond sight. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my tent for hours, every shadow suddenly suspect. When the sun finally rose and a pale light filtered through the fabric, I unzipped the tent with trembling hands and stepped out. The air was cold, still. The tracks were back. Fresh, closer than before, they led right up to the tent. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time, close enough to hear me breathe, close enough to see me through the nylon, and they hadn't left a note, a sound, a trace, just the prints, and a feeling I'd never forget. I packed up before breakfast. I didn't even bother rolling my tent. I just crammed everything into the Jeep. As I slammed the door shut, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure, just watching, not moving. I gunned the engine and tore down the fire road, not stopping until I saw pavement again. I never told anyone the full story. I said I got sick, cut the trip short. But sometimes late at night, I wonder if that place is still empty, if someone or something is still living near that old station. And more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. Last week, I finally looked at the photos from the trip. Most were trees, rocks, landscapes, but one made my stomach drop. It was a shot of the ranger station taken just before dusk. In the bottom corner of the frame, almost hidden by shadow, a face, watching me. It started during finals week. The campus library had a certain tension to it that time of year, a kind of anxious buzz that settled into the walls. Desperate students occupied every available table, eyes red from caffeine-fueled all-nighters, fingers clacking away at keyboards like their degrees depended on it. Maybe they did. I avoided the chaos. I preferred the top floor, tucked away in a quiet corner between dusty volumes of legal theory and outdated law journals no one touched anymore. It was always colder up there, the fluorescent lights flickering inconsistently overhead, and the silence felt thick, like a held breath. Some found it eerie. I found it perfect. There were no group study sessions up there, no whispered gossip, no click of group text notifications. Just the occasional shuffle of paper, the muted hum of my laptop fan, and the steady scratch of highlighter against textbook. I was a junior at a mid-sized university in Pennsylvania, psychology major, GPA in the high threes. I didn't party, didn't socialize much. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. People were loud, messy, distracting. Up there alone, I could focus. I could think. That Monday, I was reviewing my notes on abnormal behavior. It seemed academic at the time. Detached. Now I realize how ironic that was. I noticed him for the first time on Tuesday. He wasn't a student, at least not one I recognized. Probably early 30s, wearing a gray windbreaker and jeans, clean-shaven, forgettable. But I saw him again the next day, and the next. He never had a laptop, never carried books, just wandered the aisles slowly, pretending to browse. At first, I thought nothing of it. People roam libraries all the time. But by Thursday, I realized he always ended up in the same row where I was sitting. Sometimes 2 aisles over, sometimes right across from me, always watching. On Friday, I switched floors. I took a seat on the second floor, busier, louder. Not my usual vibe, but I needed to know if I was imagining things. 20 minutes in, he showed up. He didn't look at me right away, just stood near the magazine rack. Then pretended to read a pamphlet, then drifted closer. I packed up and left. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? A guy keeps showing up where I study? He hadn't done anything, not technically, but I felt it. That tension in my spine, that crawl under the skin. The next week, I changed my schedule. Studied in the mornings, left before dark. He adjusted. If I came at 10, he'd be there by 10:20. If I left early, he'd follow a few minutes later. Not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to notice. I started tracking it in my notebook. Times, locations, behavior. It was like my own private case study. But the reality was far from academic. It happened on a Wednesday. The library was quieter than usual. Finals had passed, and most students had disappeared back to their hometowns or summer internships. I was packing up slowly, methodically, trying to cling to some kind of routine. My headphones dangled around my neck. My notes were in a neat stack. I was about to slide my laptop into my bag when I sensed someone standing just a little too close. He stepped forward like he'd been waiting for the right moment. "You're here a lot," he said. His voice was calm, pleasant on the surface, but his smile didn't match. It was the kind of smile that made your instincts twinge. I looked up briefly, nodded, and offered a quick, "Yeah, you're very focused. It's impressive." I didn't respond, just zipped my bag and stood up, trying to make it clear I wasn't interested in chatting. "I'm late for class," I said, moving to walk past him. He stepped aside with a lingering smile. "Of course, don't let me keep you." That night, while unpacking, I found a note slipped into the front pocket of my backpack, folded neatly. The paper was warm from being against my laptop. I unfolded it, feeling my stomach tighten before I even saw the words. One line, written in careful script. "You look even better when you're not pretending." I went to campus security the next day. They asked if he'd touched me, threatened me, followed me off campus. I said no. They said they'd look into it. Told me to avoid being alone at night. Offered a whistle. That was it. No one followed up. 2 days later, I saw him waiting outside the dorm. I stayed inside. Called campus police. By the time they arrived, he was gone. No cameras covered that side of the building. I stopped going to the library, started studying in dining halls, but he found me. Always from a distance, always just long enough for me to see. My grades slipped. I stopped sleeping. I felt like prey. My roommate went home early for break. I stayed behind to catch up on work. The dorm was nearly empty. I checked the windows twice, locked the door. Still, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. A knock at the door. Soft, 3 times. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I left campus the next morning, went to the city police this time, filed a full report, showed them my notebook. They took it seriously, pulled footage, tracked parking lot logs. He wasn't a student, not faculty, not staff. No one knew how he'd gotten access. They found his car 2 blocks from campus. Inside, photos, me, dozens of them shot through windows, across tables, in class. He was arrested, restraining order, charges, trial pending. But that's not the end. I still don't go to libraries. I still feel eyes on me when I walk alone. And sometimes late at night I dream about footsteps in the stacks, getting closer and closer, until I wake up to silence and find a folded note under my door.